It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally stepped into the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building after a long day at the office. The night was quiet, wrapped in a heavy stillness that pressed against my skin like a silent weight. My legs, weakened and numb from months of battling a chronic illness, exacerbated by long hours sitting at my desk, trembled as I reached the door. Suddenly, dizziness swept over me, a sharp, unforgiving wave that stole my balance. My foot caught on the threshold, and before I could steady myself, I collapsed hard onto the cold floor. The impact sent a shock of pain through my knees and back. Panic flooded my chest as I struggled to breathe the harsh fluorescent lights above, casting stark shadows on the walls. I lay there vulnerable and exposed, the silence around me broken only by my shallow breaths and the faint echo of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then breaking through the quiet came a voice, sharp, cold, and unyielding. "Don't help that cripple." My mother's words cut through the hallway like a whip, her tone laced with contempt and cruelty. The words weren't whispered. They were shouted, with a force meant to humiliate, to push me further into my despair. I felt the heat of eyes turning toward us, the slow shuffle of neighbors waking, drawn by the sudden noise, and the unmistakable sound of me falling. Doors cracked open and I could hear voices rising in alarm. "Call 911." Someone shouted urgently. The flood of emotions was overwhelming: shame, pain, helplessness, and an aching sense of betrayal that sank deep into my bones. The woman who had once held my hand and wiped away tears now stood back, her expression unreadable, refusing to help, refusing even to show mercy. As the seconds stretched into minutes, I lay there barely able to move, wondering how it had come to this moment, when the person who should have been my safe harbor became the source of my greatest pain. The piercing wail of a siren soon filled the hallway, growing louder and more insistent, promising aid and rescue. But as I was lifted from the cold floor, carried away from the place I once called home, I realized this was more than a medical emergency. This was a breaking point, the moment my world shifted irreversibly. The battle wasn't just against my failing body or my illness. It was against the very people who should have been my champions. And yet, even in this darkness, a small spark of defiance ignited within me. I wasn't finished fighting, not yet. If you have ever felt alone in your pain, silenced by those you trusted most, then stay with me. This is a story about survival, about reclaiming power and refusing to be invisible. Lying in the sterile hospital room, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the air, I felt an ache far deeper than the physical pain that racked my body. For months, my legs had weakened progressively, a cruel consequence of a chronic circulatory disorder worsened by the long hours I spent sitting at my desk job. Every day was a battle to push through the fatigue, to mask the tremors, to pretend I was stronger than I actually felt. But what wore me down more than the illness itself was the cold reality waiting for me at home. My mother, Susan, the woman who once held me close and comforted me, had become my greatest adversary. Instead of offering warmth and support, she chose scorn and indifference. I remembered the countless times she dismissed my suffering as nothing more than weakness, calling me a burden she no longer wanted to bear. "Stop being so fragile," she would say with biting sarcasm. "You're making life harder for everyone." Those words were like daggers cutting through my already fragile self-esteem and threatening to shatter my spirit. The emotional wound she inflicted ran far deeper than any bruise or scar. I realized then that surviving wasn't just about managing my illness. It was about navigating a toxic family environment that refused to accept me as I was. The stakes were painfully clear. Without proper care and compassion, my physical condition would deteriorate rapidly. But worse than that was the damage to my soul, the isolation and rejection that threatened to erase my very identity. I was trapped between the limitations of my own body and the cruelty of someone who should have been my protector. My future, my dreams, and my sense of self were hanging in the balance. Loneliness settled in around me like a suffocating fog. Friends didn't understand the complexity of my illness, colleagues judged my absences, and family only saw a weak, inconvenient version of me. Yet even in that darkness, a small spark of defiance flickered inside me. I knew I could not allow this pain to define who I was or dictate my future. As the days in the hospital stretched on, I clung to the hope that this ordeal could mark a turning point. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. If you have ever felt abandoned by those you love, if you have battled not just illness, but the loneliness and stigma that come with it, know that you are not alone. The road ahead is difficult and fraught with pain, but within that struggle lies the possibility of healing strength and freedom. It was beneath those harsh fluorescent lights, lying helpless yet determined, that I made a silent vow to reclaim my life. No matter the cost, no matter the challenges, I would fight to survive not just in body, but in spirit. The stakes had never been higher, and I was ready to face them head on. From the earliest days I can remember, my relationship with my mother Susan was tangled in a web of high expectations and harsh judgments. She was once a respected school teacher, someone who valued discipline and achievement above all else. Growing up, her approval felt like the currency I desperately needed but could never fully earn. The moment she discovered my illness, everything shifted. Instead of offering comfort, she viewed my condition as a failure, a personal flaw that reflected badly on her. I recall the cold mornings when she would stand over me, arms crossed, eyes scanning for signs of weakness or self-pity. "You have to be strong," she would say, her voice firm yet devoid of warmth. "No one else will carry you through life." Those words became a relentless mantra, echoing through every interaction. I tried to live up to her impossible standards, masking my pain with forced smiles, and pretending that the trembling in my legs was just tiredness. But behind closed doors, the reality was far darker. The house we lived in was suffused with tension, a quiet but persistent storm brewing beneath the surface. Arguments over small mistakes would spiral into nights filled with silence and cold shoulders. My mother's criticism was never constructive. It was laced with bitterness and disappointment, making me feel like a constant disappointment. The more I tried to prove myself, the more she seemed to pull away, as if my struggles made her uncomfortable or ashamed. She controlled everything from the way I dressed to the people I could see, and she had an uncanny ability to make me doubt my own judgment. I remember the nights I cried quietly in my room, wishing for a mother who would hold me instead of pushing me away. Her version of love was wrapped in control and cold logic, leaving no room for vulnerability or weakness. When my illness worsened, her attitude hardened. Instead of adapting or helping, she blamed me for giving up or seeking attention. The very idea of compassion was foreign to her. Family gatherings became minefields where whispers and sideways glances reminded me that I was the problem, the one dragging the family down. Yet despite all this, I yearned for her approval, for the warmth that I saw in other families, but never in mine. The toxicity of our relationship became a heavy chain around my spirit, restricting my growth and fueling my insecurities. Looking back, I can see how her own fears and unresolved pain shaped her behavior. She was trapped in her own cycles of control and denial, passing down a legacy of suffering without meaning to. Understanding this didn't excuse the hurt, but it gave me a new perspective, a chance to break the pattern rather than repeat it. As the illness progressed and I became more dependent, the power dynamic shifted. What once was subtle control turned into outright domination. Her refusal to acknowledge my pain and her insistence that I keep up appearances created a suffocating atmosphere. I was expected to be the perfect daughter, strong, capable, and flawless, even when my body was failing me. This contradiction tore me apart. The emotional wounds inflicted by my mother cut deeper than any physical symptom. They seeped into every corner of my life, shaping how I saw myself and how I interacted with the world. The shadow of her judgment loomed over me, making it difficult to trust, to love, or to hope. But in that darkness, a small flicker of resistance began to grow. I realized that the toxic roots of my family did not have to define my future. I could choose a different path, one where my worth wasn't dictated by others, but by my own acceptance and strength. Breaking free from the grip of a toxic family is one of the hardest battles a person can face. It requires courage to confront the pain, honesty to see the truth, and resilience to rebuild. My story is not unique, but it is mine to tell. And as I share it, I hope to give voice to those who feel trapped by their own family's shadows, to remind them that freedom is possible even when the darkness seems overwhelming. The journey ahead will be long and challenging, but it is also filled with the promise of healing growth and reclaiming life on my own terms. As my illness progressed and my dependence grew, the tension within our household reached new heights. My mother's control intensified, manifesting not only in harsh words, but in actions that crossed into the territory of emotional abuse. She would belittle my efforts to manage my condition, dismiss my pain, and insist that I was exaggerating just to gain sympathy. The days blurred into nights filled with arguments, her voice sharp and unforgiving, leaving me mentally and emotionally drained. But the darkest shadow in my life wasn't just my mother. It was James, my boyfriend at the time. Initially, he seemed kind and understanding, the calm in the storm that was my family life. But over time, his true nature revealed itself. The verbal jabs turned into physical violence. I learned to hide bruises beneath long sleeves to mask the trembling that wasn't from illness, but fear. James exploited my vulnerabilities, using my health as a weapon against me, threatening to leave if I didn't comply with his demands. He controlled my finances, even intercepting the disability checks meant for my care. I felt trapped in a nightmare where every relationship became a prison. What made it worse was my mother's unwavering support for James. She saw him as a savior, someone who kept me in line and helped me be responsible. Her blindness to his abuse felt like another betrayal, reinforcing the message that I was alone and powerless. The emotional toll was immense. I doubted my own reality, questioned my worth, and struggled to find the strength to speak out. The cycle of abuse fed on silence and shame, making it harder each day to break free. The night I collapsed at my door was the breaking point. After a particularly violent confrontation, I fled my apartment, the pain in my body matched only by the agony in my heart. My mother's voice followed me down the hallway loud and clear. "Don't help that cripple!" Those words echoed in my mind as neighbors rushed to my aid and the ambulance arrived. It was a moment of utter humiliation, but also the first step towards reclaiming my life. I realized then that the stakes were no longer just about survival. They were about justice, freedom, and healing. The abuse I endured was not just physical, but psychological, a complex web of control that threatened to consume me entirely. Breaking free meant confronting not only James, but also the toxic family dynamics that allowed his behavior to thrive. It required immense courage to face the truth and seek help in a world that often turns a blind eye to the realities of domestic violence, especially when intertwined with chronic illness and family loyalty. But even in the darkest moments, a flicker of hope remained. The arrival of emergency responders, the kindness of neighbors, and the support of advocates gave me a glimpse of a future where I could be safe and respected. My journey to escape the cycle of violence and reclaim my dignity was just beginning, and I was determined to fight with everything I had. If you or someone you know is trapped in a similar situation, remember that help exists and you are not alone. The path to healing is difficult but possible, and every step towards freedom is a victory worth fighting for. That night, as I lay curled up on the cold hospital bed, the weight of betrayal settled heavily on my chest. The image of my mother's face twisted with disdain as she shouted, "Don't help that cripple," replayed relentlessly in my mind. It wasn't just the physical pain of my collapse that hurt. It was the shattering realization that the people I should have been able to rely on the most had abandoned me in my moment of greatest vulnerability. I had spent years fighting against my own body, but now I had to confront a deeper battle against the very people meant to love and protect me. The trust I had once placed in my family felt like fragile glass, cracked and splintered beyond repair. Yet beneath that pain was a rising tide of determination. This was my breaking point, yes, but it was also the moment I resolved to reclaim control over my life. I could no longer allow fear, shame, or loyalty to hold me hostage. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, Legal battles, emotional reckonings, and the difficult process of rebuilding my identity, but I knew that standing still was no longer an option. The support I received from the emergency responders, the concerned neighbors, and the compassionate medical staff illuminated a new reality. I was not invisible, not forgotten, and not alone. Each act of kindness strengthened my resolve to fight not just for survival, but for justice and respect. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chapter where I would no longer be silenced or controlled. If you have ever felt betrayed by those closest to you, know that your pain is valid and your voice matters. The breaking point may feel like the end, but it can also be the catalyst for profound change and healing. I was ready to take that first step into the unknown, armed with the courage born from pain and the hope for a better tomorrow. The moment the neighbors called 911 was more than just a cry for emergency help. It was the first crack in the wall of silence that had surrounded my suffering for so long. As the paramedics rushed me to the hospital, I realized that my pain was no longer mine alone to bear. The compassionate voices of strangers, the gentle hands that steadied me, and the caring eyes that met mine offered a glimpse of hope I hadn't dared to imagine. In the days that followed, I was connected with social workers and advocates specializing in domestic violence and chronic illness support. They listened without judgment, helping me understand that my experiences were valid and that I deserved safety and respect. For the first time, I began to see a path toward freedom, a path paved with community understanding and empowerment. Sharing my story was terrifying at first. The fear of backlash, the shame ingrained by years of control and abuse weighed heavily on me. But as I opened up, I found strength in the solidarity of others who had walked similar paths, online group support circles, and advocacy organizations became lifelines offering not only advice, but a renewed sense of belonging. My voice, once silenced by fear and manipulation, began to rise. I realized that breaking the silence was not just an act of courage, it was a revolutionary step toward reclaiming my life. The external support I received fueled my determination to face the battles ahead. It also illuminated the larger systemic issues that kept so many trapped in cycles of abuse and neglect. By speaking out, I was not only fighting for myself, but contributing to a movement that sought to give power back to the voiceless. The community that rallied around me reinforced a vital truth: no one should have to endure pain in isolation. Together, we could confront the darkness, challenge injustice, and build a future where compassion and dignity prevail. If you find yourself in a similar place, remember that help exists and that your story matters. Breaking the silence is the first step toward healing, and it's a step worth taking. After the chaos of that night and the long days of healing, I began to piece myself back together, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. The journey was far from easy. The scars ran deep, and the memories of betrayal lingered like shadows. But within me, a fire was ignited, a fierce determination to reclaim my life and rewrite my story on my own terms. I started small. I returned to work this time with a new perspective and a clear boundary. No one, not even my family, could control my path. I transitioned into freelance work, which allowed me flexibility to manage my health and regain independence. But my fight wasn't limited to personal survival. I became an advocate, not just for myself, but for others trapped in similar cycles of abuse and neglect. I shared my story through blogs and podcasts, connecting with a community that understood the complex intersection of chronic illness and domestic violence. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from people who saw themselves in my experiences, who found strength in my courage. Building this community became a lifeline, reminding me daily that healing was possible and that resilience could flourish even in the darkest soil. At the same time, I began gathering evidence, documenting the abuse, the neglect, and the financial exploitation that had stolen so much from me. I consulted with legal professionals who specialized in family law and advocacy for vulnerable adults. The process was daunting, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but I was no longer alone. I had allies, both within the legal system and the support networks I had cultivated. With their guidance, I prepared to face my mother and the abuser, who had dominated my life for so long. I learned to present my case calmly and confidently, refusing to be diminished by the past. Each step forward was a victory, a reclaiming of power that had long been denied. This was more than a legal battle. It was a reclaiming of my dignity and my right to live free from fear and control. Through it all, I held on to the faces of those who had supported me, the neighbors who called 911, the social workers who stood by my side, the strangers who became friends. Their belief in me fueled my resolve, and as I stood on the threshold of a new chapter, I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for others still searching for their way out of darkness. If you are reading this and feeling lost or trapped, know that your strength is already within you. The path to freedom begins with a single step, and sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most powerful transformations. The day I finally faced my mother and James in court was one I had both dreaded and anticipated for years. The courtroom was cold and silent, the polished wood and sharp lighting lending a weight to every word spoken. As I sat beside my attorney, a quiet resolve settled over me. This was no longer just about my pain or my suffering. It was about justice, accountability, and breaking free from the chains that had bound me for so long. The proceedings were intense. Evidence of the emotional abuse, the physical violence, and the financial exploitation was laid bare before the judge and all present. Photos of bruises, medical reports, and intercepted messages painted a damning picture of a toxic environment that had nearly destroyed my life. My mother, once a figure of authority and control, now appeared vulnerable under the scrutiny of the law. Her carefully maintained facade cracked as witnesses testified, revealing the depth of her neglect and complicity. James, too, could no longer hide behind charm or denial. His threats and manipulation were exposed, and the court saw him for what he truly was: an abuser preying on weakness. The judge's words were firm and decisive. Custody and control of my affairs were granted to me, along with orders for restitution and protective measures against both defendants. The relief I felt was profound, but so was the weight of the journey that had brought me here. Justice was not just a verdict, it was a reclamation of my dignity and my future. In the days that followed, news of the case spread quietly through our community. Some offered sympathy, others whispered judgments, but none could deny the courage it took to stand up and speak out. My mother's reputation, once untouchable, was forever altered. James faced legal penalties that would remind him of the consequences of his actions. For me, this victory was bittersweet. It marked the end of a chapter filled with pain, but also the beginning of a life rebuilt on my terms. I knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of possibility rather than despair. My story was no longer one of victimhood, but of resilience and hope. If you find yourself facing similar battles, remember that justice is possible and your voice can be your strongest weapon. No one deserves to live in fear or silence, and there is strength in demanding accountability. Reclaiming my life after the storm was neither swift nor simple. The wounds, both seen and unseen, took time to heal, and the echoes of past betrayals lingered longer than I expected. Yet with every passing day, I found new strength in the knowledge that I was no longer defined by my pain or my past. I began to rebuild not only my body, but my sense of self. Therapy sessions helped me unpack years of emotional baggage, teaching me to set boundaries and recognize my own worth beyond the judgments of others. I rekindled relationships with friends I had drifted away from, and forged new connections within communities of people who understood the intersection of chronic illness and family trauma. My work shifted focus as well. I dedicated myself to advocating for those who, like me, had suffered in silence. Through speaking engagements and writing, I found purpose in sharing my journey not as a tale of victimhood, but as a beacon of hope. Slowly, confidence replaced doubt. I learned to celebrate small victories a day without pain, a moment of joy, a conversation where I was heard and valued. The journey was filled with setbacks, but I embraced each as an opportunity to grow stronger. Most importantly, I found forgiveness not for the abusers or my mother, but for myself. Forgiveness meant releasing the burden of blame I had carried, allowing space for healing and peace. This renewal was not just personal, it was transformative. I began volunteering with organizations that support survivors of domestic abuse and chronic illness, giving back to a community that had given me so much. Every story I heard, every person I helped, reinforced the truth that resilience is born from struggle and that self-worth is the foundation of freedom. Looking back, I see how far I have come from the helpless girl collapsed at her door to a woman standing tall and unafraid. The scars remain, but they are a testament to survival, not defeat. If you are on your own path to healing, know that your worth is immeasurable and that each step forward is a triumph. The road may be long, but it leads to a life filled with dignity, love, and hope. As I stand here today, reflecting on the journey that brought me from the darkness into the light, I feel compelled to share a message, especially for the women over 50 who often become the pillars of strength and guidance in their families and communities. You hold the power to break cycles of toxicity and abuse, to be the voice that nurtures healing instead of pain. Too often, family secrets and unspoken rules perpetuate harm across generations. But it doesn't have to be this way. Your compassion, your willingness to listen and to act, can create a sanctuary where the vulnerable find safety and the silenced find voice. I urge you to recognize the signs of control manipulation and abuse not just in others, but within your own homes. Speak out when you see injustice. Stand beside those who are struggling, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Help them see that they are not alone and that there is a path to freedom. Remember, healing begins with empathy. Let us redefine what it means to be a family, not one bound by silence and fear, but by understanding respect and unconditional love. To those still trapped in toxic cycles, I want you to know this: your pain is valid, your voice matters, and your strength is real. No one has the right to diminish your worth or control your life. The road to healing is not linear or easy, but every step forward chips away at the chains of the past. And for those who have survived, your stories are powerful weapons against abuse. Use them to inspire, to educate, and to bring hope. Together, we can build a future where no one has to live in fear or silence. My journey has taught me that justice is not just found in courtrooms, but in everyday acts of courage and kindness. It is found in the decision to say enough and to reclaim your life. As I close this chapter, I stand not just as a survivor, but as a testament to the power of resilience, love, and hope. Let us break the cycle. Let us choose healing. And let us walk forward together.